Hey everyone, this is chapter 5 of The Forging of the Modern State by Evans. The title is The New Political Economy and the Early Impact of Laissez-faire. Section 1. Only rarely does an idea, still less a body of theory, come to dominate the economic and social life of an age. Yet such a claim can be fairly made for the notion of free trade put forward in Adam Smith's Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, first published in 1776. Smith challenged the assumption on which traditional economic policy had been based, that a nation thrives by protecting its manufactures against competition from others. The paraphernalia of protection, tariffs on foreign imported goods, bounties on domestic manufactures of exportable commodities, monopolies, tolls, and the like, was assembled to ensure that the protecting nation acquired a favorable balance of precious metals. Such dominance of the main media of exchange, so the argument ran, ensured political strength as well as economic hegemony. What Smith called the, quote, mercantile system, end quote, was founded on political power gained through economic predominance. Smith's view is that tariffs and the like hampered the growth of world trade and held back living standards in all countries, whether or not they had a favorable balance of trade. Free trade and an end to controls on production saw prices regulated by the only true arbiter, demand in an open market. Competition ensured best quality goods at lowest practicable prices. The search for an adequate share of the market under conditions of perfect competition ensured the adoption of efficient means of production and a rational deployment of labor. The conflicting self-interests of producer and consumer to sell in the dearest market and buy in the cheapest were reconciled to the benefit of all parties. Britain's adoption of the broad principles of the wealth of nations, caused cautiously in respect of foreign trade, eagerly in regard to the organization of labor and production, formed the basis of 19th century economic liberalism. By the 1850s, free trade had become an unshakable tenet of government faith, relevant alike to social conditions and economic policy. Rarely, if ever, has a political or economic philosophy achieved such general assent from such a large proportion of educated minds. Wealth of Nations is a pinnacle of late 18th century Enlightenment thought. It is a logical, cogent, rational, powerful, yet deeply humane book, but neither its logic nor its humanity explains why it was so influential. Political actions are rarely swayed by power of argument alone. None knew better than Smith the extent to which people respond to self-interest. The book issued from one of the most educationally advanced nations in Europe. Smith was professor of moral philosophy at Glasgow University, and one which had been since the Union of Scotland and England in 1707 part of the most potent commercial force in the world. Wealth of Nations spoke directly to the self-interest of commercially minded men. Its beautiful reasoning is only a minor factor in its success. If free trade puts a premium on efficiency, it naturally offers a head start to those who are already more efficient or have the resources rapidly to become so. Industrial developments from the last quarter of the 18th century vastly increased Britain's already substantial economic advantages. Wealth of Nations showed how to maximize them. It was perfectly in tune with the needs of the age. Smith is popularly considered the supreme apologist of free enterprise capitalism. His true concerns were much broader. He is best characterized as one of the ablest sons of the Enlightenment. A widely traveled and broadly educated academic, his aim was to foster the understanding of man as an ethical, social, and economic being. The removal of the fetters from the economy was part of the much grander design to liberate mankind from the restrictive and archaic panoply of arbitrary government. He took from the French physiocrats their concern to shift discussion from producers to consumers and their tripartite division of wealth into rent, profit, and wages. He hoped to give back to the Enlightenment a fully integrated study of man and society. Wealth of Nations should thus be seen as the economic counterpart to Smith's earlier ethical study, Theory of Moral Sentiments, published in 1759. Though he did more than anyone to establish the science of political economy, it was his early 19th century successors, David Ricardo, J.R. McCulloch, and Nasu Sr., who concentrated on and deepened the economic analysis. Smith's interests were eclectic. Deepened the economic analysis. Smith's interests were eclectic. The most far-reaching aspect in Wealth of Nations is the thesis that the activities of the individual in a free market motivated by self-interest nevertheless benefit society as a whole. He, quote, generally neither intends to promote the public interest nor knows how much he is promoting the public interest, end quote, but in seeking, quote, his own gain, he is led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention, end quote. Such a profound fortuity, however, obtains only in a free market. Under a protective regime, prices are pushed up and the miraculous machinery of the market malfunctions. Since Smith also believed with the socialist thinkers who were to follow him that, quote, labor is the ultimate price which is paid for everything, end quote, labor should be used with optimum efficiency, since the prices of the inefficient would be undercut. The free market further aids the proper allocation of economic resources. Laborers will be enticed from unprofitable to profitable sectors by the higher wages produced in the sectors can afford and will need to pay. Market forces contain their own dynamic for redistribution and development. Absence of constraint not only satisfies the consumer with low prices, it offers opportunity for investment, development, and further economic growth which benefits producer and consumer alike. The other great foundation stone for classical economics was Smith's analysis of the division of labor. This, the point of departure in Wealth of Nations, argues that specialization of productive functions is determined by demand. Producers will develop their manufacture using more sophisticated processes and training more men to perform a smaller range of tasks more efficiently in response to demand for their product. The contention that economic growth was largely dependent upon technological specialization in the manufacturing sector was further evidence of its attraction for a nation on the threshold of an industrial revolution. It is often forgotten both that Adam Smith's sympathies and concern rested primarily with the consumer and that he had a profound distrust of merchants and manufacturers. It was a great virtue of the free market in his eyes that it clipped the wings of what subsequent generations, schooled by Ricardo, called the capitalist classes. If this seems a paradox in the profit of laissez-faire liberalism, it is so only while people are content with a superficial image. Smith believed that producers and dealers conspired to distort the market with controls and tariffs. From these, only producers and dealers benefited. As Smith noted, quote, to widen the market and to narrow the competition is always in the interest of the dealers. End quote. The ultimate aim of such perversions was monopoly production, with consumers forced to pay whatever price was demanded. Smith was especially scathing about those large commercial incorporations. The East India Company stood out in this, which were not only intrinsically powerful, but also exerted pressure on government to protect their narrow interests. Wealth of Nations is liberally spiced with anti-mercantile abuse. Smith spoke of their, quote, impertinent jealousy, end quote, mean rapacity, and, quote, monopolizing spirit. They represented, quote, an order of men whose interest is never exactly the same with that of the public, who have generally an interest to deceive and even to oppress the public, end quote. Their naturally acquisitive interests were best tempered by the independent arbitration of a genuinely free market. It is not surprising that the tobacco merchants of Glasgow, struggling with a trade depression in the mid-1770s, found little in Smith's writings to their liking. Wealth of Nations is anything but an unqualified endorsement of merchants and manufacturers, yet their 19th century successors regarded it as their lodestar. As invariably happens to those rare seminal works of political or economic science, their adherents simplify, if not distort, the message. Unpalatable observations tend to be ignored. Thus, the capitalist classes forgot Smith's insults, since many of them stood to profit from freeing the market. Nor do they recognize his more or less explicit espousal of a labor theory of value, while pressing the government not to implement wage regulation statutes. Landowners were mostly content for the market to fix laborers' wages. As we shall see, however, they would not be prepared to accept Smith's view that, quote, even the free importation of foreign corn could very little affect the interest of the farmers of Great Britain, end quote. Nor did a government of property owners draw attention to the class implications of his injudiciously honest observation that, quote, civil government is in reality instituted for the defense of the rich against the poor, or of those who have some property against those who have none at all, end quote. Smith's message was assimilated selectively, the selection based on just the rational self-interest which was at the root of his psychological and economic thinking. Adam Smith's commitment to laissez-faire was more guarded than was that of heedless or dogma-driven, quote, privatizers or, quote, neoliberals in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Smith argued that the state should liberally provide those services which individuals or companies would not. Thus, not only external defense, but also internal security should be considered necessary charges upon the state. Likewise, a state education system. Smith's reservations about full laissez-faire in overseas trade, however, had great impact. Where there was clash of interest between the needs of national security and those of trade, the former should have priority. Quote, defense is of much more importance than opulence, end quote. This led him to defend the role of the Navigation Acts, the bedrock of the old mercantile system. Smith was prepared to countenance limited protection of goods with obvious defense value, such as British-made sailcloths and gunpowder. Such exceptions should not undermine the view of Smith on free trade, of course, or his distrust of colonial developments with their strong monopolist implications. However, it is possible to agree with the Whig politician and part-time political economist Harry Brougham, Brougham, that Smith's acceptance of the primacy of national defense distanced him from physiocrat free traders. If not putting him midway between them and out mercantilists on the colonial issue. Certainly Smith's ambivalent views proved embarrassing to later anti-colonial economists like Ricardo and McCulloch. William Pitt knew and admired Smith. He derived great intellectual stimulus during his unprecedentedly brief youth from reading Wealth of Nations in the company of his cousin and future cabinet colleague, William Grenville. As was seen earlier, see Chapter 4, however, the direct impact of liberal economics on trade policies in the 1780s was limited. It might almost be argued that Pitt was more taken with Smith's exceptions to free trade rule than with the broad sweep of his argument. He could certainly find warrant for the 1786 Navigation Act in Book 4 of Wealth of Nations. Such a view does scant justice to Pitt's intellectual appreciation, but it recognizes his strength as a practical politician. Had Shelburne survived longer in office, there can be little doubt that Smith's policies would have been more rapidly and probably more extensively translated into action. Shelburne, an intellectual in politics if ever there was one, was an ardent convert to the new thinking, and Pitt's reputation as a man committed to free trade derives from his early connections with Shelburne. Pitt's career was less influenced by Shelburne than some writers suppose. Pitt was a practical politician to his fingertips. Shelburne was not. Shelburne lived in the heady world of ideas. Pitt, though his acute mind assimilated them rapidly enough, did not. Like most successful prime ministers, Pitt was a pragmatist, which is not to say that pragmatists necessarily make successful prime ministers. His commitment to free trade was always tempered by diplomatic and commercial realities as by the need to treat new concepts cautiously. His policy of reciprocal trade agreements might have borne more fruit in the 1790s had not the French wars driven him back to protection. In any event, British colonial successes had been achieved by protection. Pitt was not the man to ditch it in a decade because of the intellectual attraction of a new system. In consequence, little of the free trade highway which Huskisson was to open up in the 1820s was cleared by Pitt. Smith's ideas continued to provoke thought throughout the war years. With varying degrees of insight, Edmund Burke, Frederick Eden, and Reverend Thomas Malthus sought to apply his lessons to the problems of scarcity and high prices. Smith expressed particular admiration for Burke. Quote, "Burke is the only man I ever knew who thinks on economic subjects exactly as I do, without any previous communication, on a particular issue, having passed between us," end quote. Smith died in 1790. The recent outbreak of the French Revolution notwithstanding, he wrote for an expansive age. His successor struggled with crisis. The foundation in 1802 of the Edinburgh Review, a scheme of bright young men like Henry Brougham and Sidney Smith, was to bring the message to a wider audience. The Review eventually became the intellectual house journal of the Whig Party. It championed both a new political economy and liberal causes such as the abolition of slavery and law reform. In the later stages of the French wars, it also published some of the most pungent free trade criticisms of the government's protectionist economic policies, many of them written by Brougham. Section 3. Malthus's contribution was distinctive. His essay on the principles of population from 1798 does not compare with Smith's work either in breadth of learning or depth of analysis, yet its influence is in some ways comparable since it deals with that most basic of economic questions, the relationship between population and means of subsistence. Malthus offered the first cogent evidence that population growth was not intrinsically beneficial, and the evidence of the first official census in 1801, together with the extrapolations of 18th century growth made by its first director, John Rickman, gave greater point to his analysis. If population had almost doubled in 100 years, which modern research confirms, the fears which suffused Malthus's book seemed all too likely to be realized. He worked from the basic hypothesis that the capability of man to reproduce himself is greater than the capacity of man to increase the means of subsistence. Population, when unchecked, increased in a geometrical ratio. For example, 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64. Subsistence increases only in arithmetical ratio. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The famous, quote, Malthusian checks, end quote, were vital since they operated to keep population and the means of subsistence in reasonable balance. They were of two types. Positive checks resulted from epidemic, famine, or war as population broke through the margin of subsistence. Preventive checks, emphasized when Malthus reworked his ideas for the second edition in 1803, resulted from conscious choice, delayed marriage resulting from economic pressure, sexual abstinence, or primitive means of contraception. Malthus thought positive checks by far the most important, with all their implications for human misery. Demographic researches, however, now lay considerable emphasis on man's ability to operate preventive checks. Malthus Malthus saw his work as a counterblast to what he considered the superficial and incautious Enlightenment ideal of the perfectibility of man. Quote, "It is, undoubtedly, a most disheartening reflection that the great obstacle in the way to any extraordinary improvement in society is of a nature that we can never hope to overcome." End quote. The, quote, "perpetual tendency," end quote, "of mankind was," quote, "to increase beyond the means of subsistence," end quote. To practical men, the downward pressure of real wages in the countryside seemed a lugubrious vindication of Malthus's notion. What could be done? It was largely because Malthus offered so little for the comfort of his fellows in a generation experiencing an unprecedented rate of population growth and frequent scarcity that economics was branded the, quote, "dismal science," end quote. Malthus condemned the Elizabethan poor law, the basic institutional remedy for distress, and the evidence of the second edition of his book suggests that his condemnation became rounder as his ideas developed. He took the view that all mechanisms which provided artificial assistance exacerbated the very problems they were designed to alleviate. Thus Pitt's Poor Law Bill in 1796 embraced, quote, "the great and radical defect of all systems of the kind, that of tending to increase population without increasing the means for its support. If the poor were aided to buy bread, they were cushioned from reality. They would respond by marrying earlier and producing more children. At best, their benefactors merely shifted a yet more serious problem on to the next generation. The iron law of subsistence was not to be bent for the satisfaction of the tender-hearted, the incautiously charitable, and especially not for the wretches under their care. When the poor asked Parson Malthus for bread, therefore, he gave them a stone, no parochial relief, no job creation schemes, not even workhouses. The market must dictate wage levels, and without supplementation, the poor must cut their cloth accordingly. They were exhorted to be more provident and self-reliant. Above all, they must restrain their appetites, both carnivorous and carnal. Malthus admitted later that the poor laws no longer worked, and consequently did not stimulate population growth. This did nothing to assuage his hostility to all forms of regulated relief. After 1805, Malthus took up residence in the new East India Company College at Haileybury, where he occupied the first chair of political economy in Britain. Thence issued a series of waspish denunciations of all objections to his iron law. He deeply resented charges made by Southey and Cobbett of inhumanity or lack of Christian charity, but considered them ignorant pinpricks which did not begin to puncture the secure ramparts of his population fortress. Though critics carped at the specifics of his differential ratio, the general imbalance between population and subsistence was undeniable. His strictures on poor relief for interfering with the laws of nature found general assent among political economists. David Ricardo, though he disagreed with Malthus on many issues, was at one with him in condemning the poor law as, quote, "indirect opposition," end quote, to the, quote, "obvious principles," end quote, by which, quote, "wages should be left to the fair and free competition of the market, and should never be controlled by the legislature," end quote. By 1820, there was immensely strong intellectual underpinning for a program of radical reform of the poor laws on laissez-faire lines. Section 4. Parliament was growing similarly reluctant to permit the exercise of old statutes regulating wages and other relations between master and man. Here free trade economics as much reinforced ancient prejudices as converted MPs to new modes of thought. By the 1790s, there was general agreement that Elizabethan wage regulation statutes were anachronistic and impractical. The new generation of writers on poverty, men such as Thomas Ruggles and Frederick Eden, exhorted the poor to sturdy self-reliance. Charity must be generated and administered locally. Paternalism could not be nationalized. In any event, the sources of government were quite inadequate to cope with the complexities any state interference would throw up. As a Buckinghamshire farmer told Arthur Young in 1795, quote, "I see so many different cases of distress in this and the adjoining parishes that I think one general rule will do more harm than good," end quote. During the two great food crises of 1795 to 96 and 1800 to 1801, Parliament refused the plea of Samuel Whitbread, a leading Foxite Whig, to set a minimum wage for laborers. It is noticeable that Whitbread himself rejected the wage regulation as a general rule. Quote, "It operated as a clog to industry. The price of labor, like every other commodity, should be left to find its own level," end quote. Minimum wages should be set by local justices of the peace only in periods of the most exceptional hardship. Nevertheless, the whole idea was rejected by Whitbread's erstwhile colleague, Edmund Burke. In his published Thoughts and Details on Scarcity, in 1795 he published Thoughts and Details on Scarcity. This pushed the non-intervention wagon several stages further than Smith in a diatribe which, it has been fairly said, transmuted the latter's, quote, "system of economic liberty into a dogmatic faith which the author might scarcely have recognized," end quote. William Pitt offered an altogether more temperate invocation of the, quote, "ample testimony," end quote, of the truth of the most, quote, "celebrated writers upon political economy," end quote. Pitt's own solution fared no better. In 1796, Pitt proposed poor law reform which would create, quote, "schools of industry," end quote, give additional relief to large families, and more generally advance the cause of self-help via subscriptions to friendly societies. Pitt's scheme faced severe criticism and was hastily withdrawn. Even in 1800, when food prices rose even higher, there was no parliamentary move to alleviate distress, beyond pious exhortations to temperate consumption among the gentry and half-hearted measures designed to increase foreign supply. By 1809, even Whitbread had given up the struggle. He refused to lend support to a petition from Scottish weavers for a minimum wage. The weavers were told by a common select committee that their claim was, quote, "wholly inadmissible in principle," end quote. Other skilled workers received similarly dusty replies in the first decade of the 19th century. The Combination Acts of 1799 and 1800, though inspired by political considerations under an anti-Jacobin purge, represented another move in the same direction. Specific associations of workmen to secure better conditions or higher wages had been proscribed by separate pieces of legislation dotted throughout the 18th century. Many, like that of 1726 against combinations of woolen workers, long predated the publications of Adam Smith. Now combinations generally were banned, with notice served that Parliament would sanction no interference with a manufacturer's unfettered right to fix wages according to their market price. Pressure to enforce clauses in the 1563 Statute of Artificers specifying a full 7-year apprenticeship to trades was likewise nugatory. 18th century prosecutions of employers for non-observance had been rare and unsuccessful, but with the massive expansion of the textile trades after 1780, the dilution of the labor market by unskilled and semi-skilled workers assumed critical proportions. Richard Sheridan, speaking on behalf of a journeyman calico printers in 1807, told of young men taking jobs at 6 shillings or even 4 shillings a week in a trade which, when properly regulated, had offered up to 25 shillings. when Yorkshire and West of England weavers had the temerity to petition Parliament in 1802 to enforce apprenticeship regulations and secure the livelihood of skilled workers, the response was a 6-year suspension of the relevant laws. Permanent abolition followed in 1809. The calico printer's case evinced much righteous indignation. The leading cotton manufacturer, Sir Robert Peel Sr., rose from a sickbed to make his only contribution of the parliamentary session, deprecating the pretensions of journeymen attempting to, quote, give the law to the masters, end quote. He even affected to believe that master manufacturers were considering emigration, quote, to some country where their property would be better protected and their trade be more free from restriction, end quote. Henry Erskine argued that the men's petition was, quote, against the first principles of civil liberty as well as against the commercial maxims which had hitherto been received, end quote. Parliament needed little persuasion to remove the few remaining obstacles to the free trade in labor. Yeah?
Poppin' John is done.
Sick.
I'm not going to do the cornbread and kale today. I just don't feel like it.
Okay. That's fine. The repeal of the Wage Regulation 1813 and Apprenticeship 1814 clauses of the Statute of Artificers was the natural culmination of the process. In each case, Parliament acted in defiance of the wishes of a majority invoked in the trading concern expressed by the traditional means of loyal petition. In April 1813, 32,000 signatures appeared on a petition calling for apprenticeship regulation to be made more effective. By the end of the French wars, paternalism supported by legislation was dead. Relations between masters and men were determined, quote, objectively, end quote, by market forces. A decade before the frontal attack on tariffs, it was the first triumph of the new political economy and a talisman for the new age.